Although the AP U.S. History Framework begins with 1491, there's some vital information that must be reviewed prior to European contact. You will hopefully have covered much of this in world history. But it is also important to note that as we look at this unit, we are going to be covering key concepts. And these here are the key concepts for Era 1. These come directly from the College Board's framework, which you have been given access to in your Google Classrooms. And the information that you're going to receive are going to support these key topics, these key concepts, and will be examples that you can draw on to explain. For example, key concept 1, as native populations migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed distinct and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environments. So we'll look at some specific examples of these societies and how they adapted to and transformed their environments, and how they are distinct from one another. So that if you were to receive an essay type question based on this, you could draw on those examples to support this particular key concept. And we'll go through with each of these. The era is divided into several key topics, in addition to looking at a context, which is always topic 1.1, and then finishing with a particular skill, either causation or continuity and change, just as an example. But the real content is going to be the ones in between those. And this Era 1, or Period 1, as the College Board will sometimes refer to it, they even refer to it as Unit 1, has 7 total topics. And again, the first and the last one don't necessarily have direct content associated with them. So that leaves 5 remaining. And so that is what this series of videos is going to focus on. And so we begin with topic 1.2, which is Native American societies before European contact. And this is where you may see some overlap with your world history course, or even earlier courses that you have taken. This ties in to the overall theme of geography and the environment. And if you look on this particular slide, we've got a summary of that. There are 8 total themes. This one is looking at how the geography and the environment helps to shape the development of America. So we begin with the first residents of what is now the United States, likely emigrating from Asia over 30,000 years ago by crossing from present-day Russia into what is now present-day Alaska, and then beginning a trek southward. A migration of humans from Eurasia to the Americas taking place via Beringia, a land bridge which formerly connected the 2 continents across what is now the Bering Strait. Falling sea levels due to the Ice Age caused this land bridge to appear. And this Ice Age began probably around 60,000 years ago, stretching through maybe 25,000 years ago. It's believed to be about when it all started. The most recent date by which this migration had taken place was about 12,000 years ago, although some archaeologists suggest that this migration could have even occurred quite a bit earlier, and possibly even in multiple waves. Still others suggest that these Paleo-Americans could have originated from Aboriginal cultures in southern and southeastern Asia, much the same way that many Pacific islands were originally populated. Researchers base this theory on similarities that have been found in artwork, pottery, and even tools and fishing techniques. because certainly there was no land bridge between anywhere and, let's say, Hawaii or even Fiji. Certainly there is a common belief that the Americas were found long before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. Some of the artifacts that survive suggest contact with Africa, ancient Egypt, or even ancient Greece thousands of years ago. It is certain that at the very least, Norse explorers arrived on the shores of Greenland and later what is now Newfoundland, then called Vinland, near the end of the first millennia AD. The remains of Norse villages have been unearthed in eastern Canada, and the Vikings were known to have been great seafarers. And really, Iceland isn't all that far from Greenland, which really isn't all that far from Canada. These early Paleo-Americans soon spread throughout the Americas, diversifying into many hundreds of culturally distinct nations and tribes. The North American climate finally stabilized about 10,000 years ago, creating conditions that are quite similar to today. This led to widespread migration, the cultivation of crops, and a dramatic rise in population all over the Americas. Between about 8000 BC and 1492, there were numerous and complex events that shaped the North American tribes, culture, language, range, and more. Before the arrival of Europeans, native populations in North America developed a wide variety of social, political, and economic structures, based in part on interactions with their environment and with each other. As settlers migrated and settled across the vast expanse of North America over time, they developed quite different and increasingly complex societies by adapting to and transforming their diverse environments. In North America specifically, you had several regions that each developed tribal cultures that were different from the other areas. These include the Plains, the Northeast Woodlands, the Pacific Northwest, and the Southwest, among others. Each region was unique, particularly in their environments, and the activities that could be conducted there. The spread of maize cultivation supported large advanced societies. Advanced irrigation allowed the development of larger communities, even cities, some of which were larger than those in Europe. In more arid regions, mobile lifestyles allowed native groups to access scarce resources. This would be expanded even further after the introduction of the horse by Spanish explorers. In areas with abundant resources, societies could develop permanent settlements and participate in both agricultural and hunter-gatherer activities. Coastal groups also had access to the vast resources that the water could provide. One of the earliest known groups from around 9200 BC was the Clovis culture, known for invention of superbly crafted grooved or fluted stone projectiles called Clovis points, first found near Clovis, New Mexico in 1932. Clovis points have been found throughout the Americas. They were known for hunting big game, notably mammoths, while the species was still living. Following the Clovis culture was the Plano or Plainview culture. Believed to have emerged after 8500 BC, they were named after the site in Plainview, Texas, where their materials were first discovered. They are associated primarily with the Great Plains area and were bison hunters and adopted mass hunting techniques to drive animal herds off of cliffs. They are believed to be the first to use grinding stones to grind seeds and meat. In the Northeast, there was the Adena culture, also called the Mound Builders, named for the estate called Adena near Chillicothe, Ohio, where their earthwork mounds were first found. The culture was centered in present southern Ohio, but also existed in Pennsylvania, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. They were the pioneer mound builders in the United States and constructed spectacular burial and effigy mounds. They settled in villages, but were primarily hunter-gatherers. They also farmed corn, tobacco, squash, pumpkins, and sunflowers at quite an early date. They may have built the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. Later mound builder cultures would also follow in the same general area. In the southeast, you have what is called the Mississippian culture, which extended from the Mississippi Valley into Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. They constructed large flat-topped earthen mounds on which were built wooden temples and meeting houses and residences for chiefs and priests. They also built huge cedar pole circles, sometimes called wood henges, as opposed to a stone henge, for astronomical observations. They were highly skilled hunters with bow and arrow, and also practiced large-scale farming of corn, beans, and squash. Falcon and jaguar were common symbols in their art. They had clear ties with Mexico. The largest Mississippian center and the largest of all mounds, known as Monk's Mound, was at Cahokia in Illinois. Other great temple centers were at Spiro, Oklahoma, Moundville, Alabama, and Etowah, Georgia. Another example from North America are the ancient Pueblo peoples, called the Anasazi by their enemy, the Navajo. They were located near the Four Corners region of the present-day United States, which is where the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico join to form a point. Because of the terrain and weather, cliff dwellings were quite common. The Anasazi were an agricultural society that cultivated cotton and wove cotton fabrics. The early Anasazi are also known as the basket maker people for their extraordinary basket weaving. They were also skilled workers in stone and constructed road networks and were avid astronomers using a solar calendar. But these societies had long disappeared by the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived. The extremely arid conditions they lived in meant that snow was their greatest source of water, specifically the snowmelt each spring, and a prolonged drought, largely due to the lack of winter snow in the very distant mountain ranges, would have made the rivers run very low, perhaps too low for irrigation purposes. It is believed that drought after about the year 1150 and erosion may have driven them from their cliffside homes. Although they disappeared before the Columbian Exchange began, they left behind many artifacts, in particular their pottery, for which they were very well known. Their descendants include the Hopi, as well as other Pueblo Indians. The spread of maize cultivation from present-day Mexico northward into the American Southwest and beyond supported economic development, settlement, advanced irrigation, and social diversification amongst societies. The practice of Three Sisters farming, in particular, contributed to successful agriculture, even in more arid and poorer nutrient regions. Squash, planted at the base of corn plants, helped shade the roots of the corn, slowing evaporation of water. And the large leaves of the squash also helped to direct rainwater to the root systems of both plants. The corn provided structural support for beans, which in turn provided nitrogen to the soil, producing larger harvests of all three crops in the future. So that Three Sisters farming is the use of corn, beans, and some type of squash or melon simultaneously in the same space. Maize allowed the development of much larger native societies, increasing populations of villages and contributing to the development of the great empires of Mesoamerica. The Maya developed in the area that encompasses southeastern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and portions of Honduras and El Salvador on the Yucatan Peninsula. Their culture was at its peak from about 250 to about 900 AD, but would later be decimated by attacks from Spanish conquistadors, beginning with Pedro de Alvarado in 1523. The Aztec Empire was formed as a result of many wars that brought many smaller groups under the control of an alliance of 3 self-governed city-states. They ruled what is today central Mexico from 1428 until their defeat by Spanish conquistadors and their native allies, led by Hernán Cortés in 1521. The empire fought the Spanish for a couple of years before the outbreak of a smallpox epidemic to which the native peoples had no natural immunities, decimating the population, killing upwards of 50%, with some estimates as high as 90% of the population dying. The Inca were the 3rd major Mesoamerican empire encountered and eventually defeated by the Spanish. It is believed that they grew to prominence after the 12th century AD, dominating what is today Peru. Spanish conquistadors moving south from Panama reached the Inca in 1526. After many years of exploration and skirmishes, Francisco Pizarro, with 180 men, plus some native allies, captured the Sapa Inca, the Incan ruler, in 1532, demanding ransom in gold and silver. Over the course of several months, 16,000 pounds of gold and about twice that amount of silver were collected. But instead of releasing the Inca ruler, Pizarro had him strangled. Societies responded to the aridity of the Great Basin and the grasslands of the western Great Plains by developing largely mobile lifestyles. The native peoples of this area tended to be nomadic, following the animals that they depended on for their food. This effect was even more pronounced after the introduction of the horse by the Spanish conquistadors. Traded, sold, or perhaps even stolen by native peoples. Some of the animals could have simply escaped. The nomadic tribes followed the herds of the megafauna of the period, isolating old, weak, or very young animals who lagged behind. Bison were generally not actively hunted until after the introduction of the horse, and many tribes changed their lifestyles completely due to the opportunities that the horse gave. Some of the tribes from this region that retained some agricultural tradition include the Osage, the Iowa, the Pawnee, and the Wichita peoples. Those who became almost fully nomadic, equestrian cultures included the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Crow, the Lakota, and the Blackfoot tribes. The Northeast included tribal cultures such as the Iroquois and the Algonquin, both peoples using reed-based longhouses, and they did a combination of hunting for deer and small game, gathering for wild roots and berries, fishing, as well as farming, planting various root crops and vegetables, usually grown in or near a village. Groups of up to 300 people were the norm. The Iroquois were based in present-day upstate and western New York. The Algonquins, primarily located in the Quebec region, and became heavily involved in the fur trade after contact with Europeans, especially trade with the French and the Dutch. A little further to the south, the Powhatan people occupied much of the area that is now Virginia. It is estimated that between 14,000 and 21,000 lived in eastern Virginia when the English colonized that area. These tribes had a complex chiefdom whereby there was a local chief as well as a paramount chief who controlled many tribes and governed it somewhat like a confederacy. Like the tribes to the north, the Powhatan lived in villages with semi-permanent houses constructed from mats placed over a flexible frame. They practiced agriculture, especially growing maize, but also hunted and fished in their area. As soil productivity declined and local fish and game were depleted, the tribes would move on to a new location. It was tribal cultures like these that the English first encountered when establishing their North American settlements. Societies in the Northwest supported themselves by hunting and gathering, and in some areas developed settled communities supported by the vast resources of the ocean. Some examples from this area include the Chinook Indians and the Nez Perce Indians. Characteristics of these societies included seasonal villages and following game and other resources within a specific territory. This game included buffalo, but again only after the introduction of the horse, elk, salmon, as well as gathering of fruits, nuts, berries, etc. Many depended heavily on the ocean and the rivers that ran through their territories. They settled along the shores, the rivers, and the creeks of southeastern Alaska, stretching all the way to northern California. And as a maritime culture, they were expert canoe builders. Salmon fishing was particularly important, and though some tribes hunted whales and other sea mammals. They developed a high culture without the benefit of agriculture, pottery, or the influence of the ancient Mexican civilizations. These tribes lived in large, complex communities, constructed multi-family cedar plank houses, and evolved a caste system of chiefs, commoners, and slaves. They were highly skilled in crafts and woodworking, and reached their peak after European contact, which allowed them to access things like steel tools. They placed an inordinate value on accumulated wealth and property, and were known for holding lavish feasts called potlatches to display their wealth and social status. California tribal cultures were even more varied and developed characteristics similar to those that existed in similar environments elsewhere in North America. With temperate rainforests, mountainous areas, coastal sagebrush, and desert areas, California's rugged topography made it difficult for her indigenous groups to travel great distances, and the region's native peoples were even isolated from each other, tending to live in large family groups or clans with little political structure, unlike the larger tribes and nations to the east and the south. Divided and isolated, the original Californians were a diverse population, separated by language into as many as 135 distinct dialects.